When people think of factors to climate change, you often think about coal, oil, factories, and even cars. What about like buildings, such as one we're standing in this very moment? Today, I'll be talking to you about sustainable architecture. So, a reason to listen to about sustainable architecture is because as climate change affects our consumer-based society more and more, it's important to know how we can create changes to decrease the effects of carbon emissions. Today, I'll be speaking to you about the contribution architecture has to the environment, the cost of materials to create sustainable architecture, and the use of green spaces. Before we begin, let's first define what sustainable architecture is. This is a form of architecture that relies on decreasing the human effect on carbon emissions. And then to follow into that, we have the Vitruvian principles created by a man named Vitruvius, who is responsible for the Vitruvian man that we know. He created these three principles: Venusa, which is beauty, Fermenta, which is durability, and Utila, which is convenience. These three principles are the basis for all architecture. However, within that, there's more than meets the eye. As buildings are supposed to regulate internal temperatures and house massive forms of electricity, this can relate to heat pollution and chemical pollution into the atmosphere. And as the Global Status Report says, buildings and construction are responsible for 37% of the carbon emissions into the atmosphere. Now, although this number is decreasing year by year, thanks to organizations such as LEED, Leadership in Environmental and Energy Designs, this number is still dramatically high, and it creates problems for people at such a high rate. Next is cost of sustainable materials. Now, an argument that I've heard is that sustainable materials are very expensive, and this is true. It can increase the cost of a building by about 10 to 11%. However, there are ways to change this cost by instead using recycled materials, which in LEED's standard for creating green architecture adds 1 point for every 10% that you use in the building. So if you use 10% of recycled materials, such as in this example of a temple, in a Buddhist temple, made of, the facade is entirely made of beer bottles, or this other building where the facade is made out of orange crates, you can then decrease the cost of the building, as well as creating another form of sustainable architecture. Next is green spaces. Green spaces are these areas of land that we dedicate for pedestrian use that are filled with vegetation. These spaces are important to us because, as described by the global status, it increases property value, increases tourism development, increases health in the area, allows for greater social inclusion, reduces air pollution, and benefits from direct recreational use. It is important to use these green spaces, otherwise developers are going to want to tear them down and put buildings on. Such as an example where we used to have the old humanities building on campus. This was torn down for green space. However, in Studio One, we are now designing a pavilion to go on top of that green space because it is not being effectively used. Today I've talked to you about the contribution green architecture has on our society, the cost of materials for sustainable architecture, and green spaces. It is vital to know that to speak against unsustainable architecture and to be aware of these spaces. So I encourage all of you to go outside this week and enjoy those green spaces so that they do not get torn down for other building uses. Yes.
What can we do to try and get more green spaces in this area, for example?
So the question in the front row was, what can we do in order to get more green spaces? In order to get more green spaces, we would need to use the green spaces first that we have in order to get the builders and architects to realize that these green spaces are being utilized and are important and are needing to expand. So for us to use these spaces properly is how we can expand into more. Yes, they're in the back.
If these green spaces were just used as green spaces, but we wanna create more jobs, we might need to take up those green spaces. What would be the deal with that, I guess?
So the question is, how can we create jobs from developing green spaces and expanding them? So green spaces doesn't just mean tearing it down for a completely bare field. This can include areas such as pavilions, parkways, trails, national parks, and from these we get jobs, such as park managers, we get people who are in the cleaning detail, we have front desk operators. These allow for jobs to be used within the green space.